So we've all sort of semi-settled. Unfortunately, we've probably lost a few people in the lunch break by the look of the table. So hopefully everyone's getting ready to come back in and get settled, because our next speaker is from the States and is being here at a little bit later in his working day to join us. So what I'd like to do now is introduce our next speaker, which is Dr. Jeffrey Bewley, New Technologies, New Phenotypes. Jeffrey's from Kentucky, where he grew up on his grandfather's dairy farm. He received a Bachelor in Animal Science, Dairy Option with the University of Kentucky. He completed his Masters in Dairy Science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and has focused on dairy modernisation. His PhD work at Purdue focused on application and economics of precision dairy farming. And I think there's something we've already heard a little bit about today. For 9.5 years, Jeffrey was on the faculty of the University of Kentucky as an extension dairy specialist. He's worked with ice robotics, performer mixed nutrition, Bovitech, Alltech, and is currently the dairy analytics and innovation scientist with Holstein Association USA. His professional interest around precision dairy monitoring, dairy records management, dairy cattle genetics and genomics, and has done a lot of work around compost barn management, freestall barns, and also has been heavily involved in fundraising for research and implementing research and being part of publishing an incredible amount of papers. So what I'd like to do on behalf of the group here is remotely welcome Jeffrey to Herd 21. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation to come speak today. I sure wish that I was able to be there in person. It would be much more fun for me and hopefully more enjoyable for you if I were there too. Maybe someday our world will come back to normal and I'll be able to travel there again. I've only been once, but I loved my visit there. So my talk today is about new technologies and new phenotypes, an area that's very interesting to me from a number of different angles. So I grew up on a dairy farm, and I was always very, very interested in genetics. In fact, when I look back, the first sire book that I ever owned, I was only 8 years old. I studied that from cover to cover. Ended up with an internship with an AI company during college. And then I thought I was going to go to graduate school in genetics, but my mentors told me I'd never find a job in genetics, so I needed to go into another area. I ended up going into dairy technology and data, and that's been a great road for me, but kind of find myself circling back in recent times toward the genetics area, and I actually am involved in some breeding with some partners in Kentucky as a hobby. So genetics is really still very interesting to me. As we get into this area and we think about phenotypes and genetics, I think it's always important to keep the old basic equation in mind of G plus E equals P, or genetics plus environment equals the phenotype. And we've made a tremendous amount of genetic progress, continue to do so, and have a lot of new tools at our disposal now. But ultimately, it all comes back to phenotype. It all comes down to what do we see on the farm. But in order for the genetic selection to work, we have to have the phenotypic data. And that's where a lot of the new opportunities through technologies come. We have the opportunity sitting in front of us now for a lot of what I call novel phenotypes. We have new data coming at us from many different angles that we'll talk about here that presents us with a really neat opportunity. The opportunity we have is that there's a lot of new data that's available to us through new technologies that can provide us with more consistent, objective measures for traits that we might not have been able to measure at all in the past, or that might have been difficult to measure. And these technologies, this phenotypic data that we get from these technologies can be incorporated into robust assessments that can be focused more on areas like animal health, reproduction, behavior, and longevity. I can't hear the audio on this video. Maybe you guys can. But this video basically shows a
So every
commercial
cow
that
can
I
let
saw
farmers know
on-
how she feels and what she needs to be healthier. All with a simple text. Ta-da! Magic can't make digital transformation happen, but we can. That's the power of VMware, part of Dell Technologies.
This is a commercial that I saw actually while I was watching a basketball game. Really interesting to me because it's about cows. It shows what we're doing with technology. And it's by a company that we don't necessarily historically think about around agriculture, a company like Dell. I really think that analytic is our next scientific breakthrough. The data that we have available and what we do with that data is a huge, exciting area for us in the dairy industry. And we look across the landscape, we see lots of companies involved in this area. We see companies that have been involved in the dairy industry for decades, and we also see a number of new startups with companies like Dell and Google and Microsoft and Apple involved, at least in the background, in many of these technologies because they see the massive opportunity for this data. I'm a sports fan. Here in Kentucky, in the United States where I'm at, basketball is a big deal. And regardless of if you like any sports at all or what sport you like, there's a lot that has occurred in the last few years with analytics. I think we can learn a lot about what the sports industry has done in terms of using data that we can apply to our dairy industry. From basketball to cows, you see two different examples here. On the left, you see players with the movement of the players tracked by wearable devices. On the right, you see cows with the movement of the cows tracked by wearable devices. And we can also think about a dynamic comparison. You see on the left a video game, whereas if you watch these players move around, you see the bubble above their head that changes the percent chance that they're going to make a shot based on where they are on the court. On the right, you see that we have a lactation curve where we're looking at the different likelihood of various events occurring within that lactation. We can do the same thing that they're doing in sports and bring that technique, bring that idea to the dairy industry. It's just basically looking at things like this. I look at this cow on the top. It was a cow that I worked with, 1363, nothing flashy about her. No one really knew who she was, but she was high production. She was feed efficient. She didn't get sick. She bred back quickly, and she milked a lot of milk every lactation for a lot of lactations. On the bottom is a basketball player that a lot of casual basketball fans wouldn't know. His name is Danny Green. Nothing flashy. No one knows who he is unless they're a hardcore fan like me. Doesn't score a lot of points. He scores when needed, but he plays great defense. And simply put, he wins games. He's won championships with 3 different teams. And analytics helps to identify the quality of player that a guy like Danny Green is, and people pay him a lot of money based on what he brings in the combination. We can do all this with data in the dairy industry. So if we look at what the basketball world's doing, they're combining a lot of different metrics from traditional statistics. So the traditional statistics that you see at the bottom here are what's going into some of these novel metrics like effective field goal percentage or player efficiency rating. In dairy cows, we can do the same thing. We can create new metrics using old data in new ways. Things like money-corrected milk, which calculates the value of the milk on a revenue basis. Retention payoff, which gives us the cow's future net revenues, or longevity-corrected milk, which looks at what's the potential milk production of the herd if we kept cows in the herd a bit longer. Of course, a lot of what we have in front of us is new technologies. I look at an area like precision dairy monitoring. Precision dairy monitoring is where we're looking at individual variables within the cow. We may be looking at something within the milk, something behavioral, something physiological, or something with the conformation of the animal. And we're tracking variables across time on the same animals. In general, we're using this data for management purposes. And I look at the cow and I think, what stories does that cow have to tell us? We can get a tremendous amount of information from an individual cow just by looking at her, of course, but we have now technologies that can measure a lot of the things that you see on the slide here today. Of course, we can use these technologies for things like estrus detection and disease detection, but I think one of the neat opportunities is what we're going to be able to do with this data from a genetic selection perspective. As you look across the landscape, you see a number of different technologies that are available. We have wearable technologies, we have image-based technologies, and milk analysis-based technologies. Dozens and dozens of these available to us on our farms today, and we're going to continue to see more innovations in this area. As we look around the cow, let's think about what we can do. We can put a neck tag on a cow. The neck tag can measure activity, rumination time, eating time, or grazing time. We can put an ear tag on an animal that would measure some of those same things. Might also be looking at the position of the animal or the cow's body temperature. We can put a leg tag on a cow to measure lying time and standing time, the number of steps. We can put a device in the tail that measures the motion associated with movement right before calving. Or we can put technologies in the parlor that can measure many different variables and look at physiologically or biologically what's going on with that particular animal. Or we can use camera systems for image analysis. So many things that we can do all around the cow. Pressure-based devices for measuring estrus detection. Rumen-based devices for measuring things like pH or temperature. It's exciting to me to see this. And a lot of this is really about taking technologies used in other industries and bringing them into the dairy industry. So we take something like an accelerometer. This is an accelerometer on the left. It's the base technology of most of the wearable technologies that are out there. It seemed crazy at first when we thought about the idea that we could have a technology sitting on the cow's ear or the cow's neck that could measure rumination behavior, eating behavior. But if you watch that cow ruminate, you see it's a very consistent motion. And we're able to take that base technology that's been applied in many other industries and bring that technology into the dairy industry. We can also take a technology to measure variables that we might not have thought about measuring before. This is an example of a technology that we developed for looking at sleep behavior, for example, for measuring rest quality relative to immune function as opposed to just rest quantity. We have a number of different technologies now that are real-time location systems. They give us the exact position of the animal every second of the day and using that information to understand the behavior of that animal. Augmented reality systems that give us the ability to view this information in the air, basically, kind of a neat way of applying that technology. Virtual fencing technology, something that you guys probably see in your part of the world more than what we do here. We can create cow-responsive environments. So if we think about when we turn the fans on or when we turn the sprinklers on, we can do this through measuring the cow's body temperature as opposed to just the outside temperature. I'm going to skip a couple of these slides. I really think, though, that as we view the future, our future is not as much in the wearable technologies as it is in image-based and milk-based technologies. So much that we can do with these technologies, we've only scratched the surface. There are a number of different developments that are occurring that I think are very, very exciting in these two areas. We have technologies, for example, that sit in the milk line that measure variables like milk fat, protein, somatic cell count, measuring progesterone, measuring pregnancy, a number of different things that we can pick up. Fatty acids, all within the milk line, where we have one device measuring many animals as she comes through the parlor. We could use image analysis, an example for this. This is an example of where we use image analysis to measure locomotion score. Or we could use an image-based device to look at the contour of the feed as a way of getting that feed volume. Video behavior, so we can measure some of those same behaviors that we talked about with the wearable devices, things like rumination behavior, lying behavior, and eating behavior with a camera system. I also see a neat opportunity sitting in front of us for using linear evaluation with an image-based technology. So we could use a technology to measure traits like rump width and udder depth very easily so that we can move toward doing genetic evaluations, doing classification through a camera-based system as opposed to a human-based system. As we look at some of these novel traits, we see that there are actually quite a few of these that are fairly heritable. We've just been lacking in the phenotypic data to be able to add these to our genetic evaluations, but many, many exciting opportunities to bring this new data into our genetic evaluations. We can look at something like body condition score. Body condition score, very useful, highly heritable, and trying to select for that animal that doesn't lose as much body condition score in early lactation. The challenge has been that we don't have many measurements for body condition score. Now with a camera-based technology, we can consistently measure body condition throughout the animal's lactation and then add that to our genetic evaluations. We can look more at heat stress genetics. Australia's been the leader in this area of being able to select for animals that are more heat tolerant, trying to use new technologies to measure things like respiration behavior and body temperature to select for animals that are more heat tolerant than others. And we can easily see when we measure things like rectal temperature, there are phenotypic and genotypic differences in a trait like that. We can even get into more sustainable areas like methane emissions, being able to select for animals that are more environmentally friendly. I think it's neat when we start thinking about how we can use some of this data in novel ways. For example, looking at estrus and fertility. We have lots of these wearable devices looking at estrus activity, but we can take that data and use that in our genetic evaluation. So here we have an example of a study where they looked at the genetic variation associated with time to first heat, the duration of the heat, and the strength of the heat based on wearable technologies. So we can more directly select for the traits that we're looking for in terms of fertility within our herds. We can look more at robotic milking, trying to select for an animal that best fits that robotic milking system. Of course, all of the AI companies have done this sort of thing where we're looking at traits that we think would be applicable to a robotic milking system. So we're specifically looking at udder traits and milking speed. But we even have examples of companies like CRV that are collecting the data directly from the robots, the phenotypic data relative to milking interval, how quickly the animal habituates to the robot, and robot efficiency, and creating genetic evaluations specifically for robot efficient animals. Even when we get into some of this data with automated calf feeders, there's a tremendous amount of data that comes out of these automatic calf feeders. And we could use variables related to daily intake, milking speed, drinking speed, average daily gain, etc., to add that to be able to select for more robust calves. These genetic evaluation opportunities, we can get information that was previously unavailable to us. We get new or improved traits because we have better data. We have more data accuracy by collecting things more frequently. We may end up with less erroneous measurements, improving the quality of the data that goes into our genetic evaluations. I think there's more and more potential for branded genetics, where bull studs may supplement technology costs in large herds in exchange for data. This would help reduce the data collection cost and could be a form of product differentiation for AI companies. Of course, this all ties into genomics. There's a tremendous amount of synergistic opportunity from precision dairy farming and genomic selection strategies. The key, though, is we have to have enough high-quality phenotypic data to be able to calculate the SNP effects. And more data is needed for lowly heritable traits. There are challenges and limitations that we have to think about. First of all, there are brand differences in measurements. Just because one technology measures rumination accurately doesn't mean all of them do. The technologies do fail sometimes. We have challenges with standardization of data and calibration of devices. Issues relative to who owns the data and who pays for what. If we're going to have all this information that can be used in our genetic evaluations, who's paying for that information? Really important, I think, that we keep in mind that we have to be measuring things accurately. We need third-party validations showing that technologies do what they say that they're going to do. Just because somebody says they accurately measure X doesn't necessarily mean that they do. We need to have some third-party verification indicating that these technologies are indeed accurate. And this is one of the reasons why I feel this. This was a data step from a study that we worked with a few years ago that really changed my thinking with technologies. We had multiple technologies on the same animals. 3 different technologies, for example, measuring rumination time. And on average, there was over 100 minutes difference in rumination time. 4 different technologies measuring lying time. And on average, over 3 hours a day difference in lying time. And 3 different technologies measuring number of steps. And on average, over 2,000 steps different per technology. Clearly, these technologies were not all measuring the same thing. Which one was right? The only way we know that is if we have those third-party validations. But this creates a challenge for us in bringing this data into genetic evaluations because clearly they're not all measuring the same thing. We also have challenges with data silos. We have a tremendous amount of information on our dairy farms, but it tends to sit in silos. That information doesn't necessarily communicate well with each other. And this isn't just a technical issue. It's fairly easy to bring data together. It's a business issue. It's difficult to get everybody to play together and a lot of challenge in front of us in terms of how we merge this data together so that we can fully capitalize on it. Luckily, I see a positive outcome for this as there are a number of different companies that are now actively involved in developing platforms for putting this data together. There are some real challenges that they're running into, but there are multiple players that I think are going to help fill this void for us in the future. Although there are many challenges associated with technologies, sometimes I think we get too caught up in what's perfect or what's ideal, and we forget that perfection is the enemy of progress. Too many times I think we think that something should be 100% accurate when maybe 80% or 90% accurate was way better than where we are today. So there's a lot of opportunity with these technologies. I think it's going to change the way we dairy farm and to change the type of information and the amount of information that we have to bring new phenotypic information in changing our genetic evaluations. Thank you for your time. Please feel free to contact me, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them now.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jeff. So, are there any questions from the room or anything from Slido come through? If there's, there will, for the expediency of time, I think we will keep moving on to our next group. So, but once again, I thank Jeffrey for his remote presentation and support. And as I said, if there are any questions, we will be following those up to come back to the speakers that are contributing from remotely. So thank you very much, Jeff.